Canada is the world's fourth largest oil producer, but 98% of its crude is shipped to the U.S. But for the first time ever, this 733-mile pipeline expansion is finally bringing Canadian oil to new buyers across the ocean.
It basically changes the game for the entire industry here.
But critics argue that investments into a stalling oil industry hamstring the Canadian economy. Canada's boom could also be a bust for the American refiners who have grown used to that cheap, plentiful oil. Here's what's at stake for the astronomically over-budget Trans Mountain pipeline expansion and what it could mean for Canada's global ambitions and the world's energy markets.
The oil and gas industry represents about 5% of Canada's GDP. The energy sector is one of the only industries in Canada that is growing.
95% of the country's oil is produced here in Western Canada. It's home to Alberta's oil sands, where producers pump out millions of barrels of thick, tar-like oil every day. But most of that oil ends up just across the border, mainly in the Midwest, instead of other global markets.
For a long time, Canada was happy to send its oil to the U.S. It's a huge market that has insatiable demand for energy.
That created a relationship where each country relied on the other. Nearly all of Canada's oil is exported to its neighbor, and that oil makes up 60% of U.S. imports. Pipeline advocates say that the heavy reliance on a single market helped push down Canadian crude prices for years.
Right now.
So they just quickly covered that topic of how much of the oil coming from Canada goes to the United States and how they believe that has reduced the price. I'm curious if they have taken into consideration the fact that most other oil prices, I would assume, are potentially crossing quite a fair span of the globe in order to actually be sold at a premium price or at a higher price. So for instance, I think they had just highlighted that most of Canada's oil basically just effectively crossed the border and stayed in that general area in the United States. And so that's far less travel and transportation and overhead for those goods. And then that's potentially less costs associated with Canada and their selling of that. And so it's possible that it's still more profitable for Canada to sell to a bordering country than another country, which I think is somewhat implied by the fact that they have gone billions of dollars over budget on this pipeline that will basically open up trade to potentially include China or other folks who are on the other end of the globe across the ocean. And so it's curious if just prices are the main factor here for Canada. Obviously, if they have more competition or they have more folks who they could sell to, then in effect, if US is kind of negotiating quite aggressively here to get the prices down, then Canada has more negotiation power to say, well, if you don't pay these prices, then I'll sell it to someone else. And that could be a factor. I'm also curious if there is another factor of this on global warming. And my expectation would be, I know certainly within the US, it's becoming more and more of a stigma to use oil in general, and for the government to use oil or be proponents of that usage. And so I'm also curious if this is related to that as well, where maybe Canada's potentially giving themselves more options such that they are not at the whim of the US, not just for prices, but also for their demand. And so potentially as US maybe over the next decade or so will hopefully reduce their general usage of oil. Maybe that's another aspect Canada is thinking of, which is they still want to sell the same amount of oil in general. And so they might need to find other consumers of it.
Now, most of the world's increasing demand is going to come from Asia. Canada has been trying to get its oil to those markets for a long time.
The problem? Alberta is here in the middle of the country and hundreds of miles away from either coast. The original Trans Mountain pipeline, first built in 1953, was the only pipeline bringing oil from Alberta to the west coast. So in 2013, energy company Kinder Morgan filed an application to expand its capacity. At the time, it was estimated to cost almost $4 billion. But the project stalled for years, facing intense opposition from environmental and indigenous groups, as well as mounting costs. In 2018, the Canadian government stepped in to finish it, buying the pipeline from Kinder Morgan. The project was ambitious, aiming to open up exports to new markets in Japan, China, and India by transporting more oil to a newly expanded Westridge Marine Terminal near Vancouver. It included almost 120 miles of reactivated pipeline, 19 new storage tanks, and 3 new shipping berths, all to triple the pipeline's capacity to ship nearly 900,000 barrels a day. In the end, it cost the government $25 billion to build, more than 6 times the original estimate.
That's always a big mistake. When the private sector says, hey, this is too risky a project, circumstances have changed, we don't think we want to build this, the government and taxpayers should not come along and say, okay, we'll build it instead.
That is quite a bit of over budget. I think they said 6 times there. And so that's a very sizable amount. In this case, they just highlighted 25 billion again. And so this could be, to some extent, what I had referenced earlier, which is they've had such an easy path to the US to be able to sell a good, in this case, oil. And so the overhead to potentially create this pipeline would have eaten into the costs of Canada and their oil sales. And so this is where they haven't quite touched on it yet, and I'm not sure if they will, of how that potentially could have benefited Canada in that case, and whether or not this has actually been a beneficial project for them. Obviously, once the pipeline is built, then you can start using it, and it can kind of recoup its costs, hopefully, from that point on. But it will also require maintenance in the long term, and so the longer the pipeline is, and especially they had highlighted some of the rough terrain that they have to go through, and curious if that will overall require Canada to noticeably increase their prices to kind of make up for this heavy upfront cost that they have now.
Thomas Gunton has analyzed the costs and benefits of projects like the expansion for decades. He estimates that taxpayers are subsidizing the cost of the project up to $14.9 billion. A spokesperson for the Canadian Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Finance said in a statement that the expansion will ensure Canada receives fair market value for its resources, adding that the Bank of Canada estimates that it will contribute 0.25% to Canada's GDP. The project promised big returns for Canada, making up $2.7 billion in lost revenue every year thanks to higher prices on the oil, and an additional $34.5 billion in tax revenue.
The Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion is of vital strategic interest to Canada. It will be built.
After 12 years of development and construction, the expansion opened at 70% capacity in May, but gains may not be as high as expected.
The idea that you were going to get higher prices, in part, was driven by the fact that this was going to be a low-cost pipeline with relatively lower cost tolls than other pipelines, and therefore, even if the price was the same, you get a higher price because the transportation costs were lower. Well, that's turned out not to be the case because they significantly underestimated the costs.
The expansion also promised to alleviate another problem Canada's growing oil sector faced, a strain on the country's export infrastructure as production increased. Now, with 600,000 barrels of increased capacity a day on the expanded pipeline, oil producers are shipping their product directly to markets including China and India. But that's been a blow to the American refiners who have been used to abundant access to discounted Canadian oil.
In June, Phillips 66, for example, one of the big refiners with a lot of refineries in the West Coast and the Gulf, said that their margins have been squeezed a little bit because all of a sudden they have less access to Canadian oil than they used to.
In a comment, Phillips 66 said that it had great flexibility in its system that can move oil into its refineries at the right time. And the shift could send ripple effects to consumers in the Midwest. Some experts expect refiners to pass higher crude costs along to customers at the pump. Better oil prices and more customers outside of the U.S. also mean a bigger geopolitical role for Canada.
Canada's access to the global market also gives the country a little bit more clout globally than it ever had before. Now, all of a sudden, Canada does have some position and some ability to kind of sway markets when they can.
But the expansion isn't guaranteed to wean Canada off the U.S. entirely, thanks to its geographic isolation.
The U.S. will always be its number one customer. The easiest way out of this quandary would be for Canada to build more pipelines to its coasts. But the prospect of another pipeline being built in Canada is unlikely.
That's partly because of heavy opposition from environmental and First Nation groups. Trudeau, whose approval rating has slipped, came under fire for his support of the pipeline expansion at the same time as he pushed to fight climate change.
Canada wants to be a climate leader and has implemented a number of policies and made international commitments to reduce by 40 to 45% its greenhouse gas emissions by 2030 and reach net zero by 2050.
Now, the biggest
Yeah, so that's an interesting aspect that they're covering right there, which is if Canada is trying to state that they are going to become like carbon neutral or carbon positive and have a positive impact on global warming, but at the same time they're potentially producing and supplying other countries with a lot more oil than they had before. That's a tough spot to be in. I think this is one of those scenarios of like, are you actually fulfilling your word in that aspect, especially if you're going to say potentially like Canada's emissions are lower, but basically like the net impact of Canada and this oil is higher. That definitely seems like that would be a tough political scenario to cover. It seems like they're about to cover it right now, so interested to hear what they say.
biggest contributor to emissions is, of course, the oil and gas sector in this country.
The greenhouse gas emissions from all of the increased oil production and transportation will make it impossible for Canada to meet its climate objectives.
It's also a major risk for Canada's geopolitical standing, at least under Justin Trudeau, because so much of the country's foreign policy has been geared towards reducing the threat of climate change.
But as growth of demand for oil slows around the world amidst a clean energy transition, critics warn of the long-term prospects of the pipeline expansion.
So the world is...
Yeah, I had touched on that a little bit earlier of presumably not just the US, but many countries are going to be looking to use oil less, which potentially is an impetus for Canada to create this pipeline because I think they stated this was about 5% of the GDP for Canada. So if you're at the whim of one country, then as their demand shrinks, then you have no option but to kind of sell less or even sell at lower prices. And so they might be pushing for this pipeline basically to buy themselves a few more years of having this natural resource that they can profit off of and potentially boost their economy, as this shouldn't be something that is long-term sustainable, considering the fact that there's so many folks fighting against global warming and carbon emissions. So likely they would have to see a drop from across the globe. And so maybe Canada is trying to grab a larger portion of the global market with the understanding that the global market is still decreasing its demand. But if they become a larger player in it and they get a larger fraction, then they can keep their economy going as it is today. And potentially that buys them time to kind of find alternatives to continue boosting their economy once this transition for oil has taken a larger effect.
Moving away from oil. How fast it's going to move away is up for discussion, but it's definitely moving away from oil. And these pipelines are going to be in trouble because there's not going to be enough oil demand to fill up the pipelines to generate the revenue required to pay for them.
For now, though, Canada is hoping that there will always be some demand for the 170 billion barrels of crude in Alberta's oil sands, particularly in developing areas of the world. And projections show that despite growth decreasing, oil demand itself will rise by the end of the decade.
Take the example of coal. People have been expecting coal to be phased out as people reduce the use of coal for producing power and whatnot. The world is using more coal right now than it ever has in history. The sense is that it'll be the same for oil.
It's an interesting sentiment. I guess that could be a scenario where per capita usage goes down, but gross usage increases as the population and as countries grow over time. That was an interesting video. Excuse me. Thank you for watching. And if you enjoyed what you saw, please hit like or subscribe. I'll see you around.